Carl Jung once said something that most people aren't ready to hear. He said that empaths don't actually attract the wrong people by accident. They attract them on purpose. Not consciously, of course. But there's a hidden psychological mechanism operating beneath their awareness. A wound so deep and so perfectly camouflaged that most empaths spend their entire lives never discovering it exists. And this wound doesn't just influence who they're drawn to. It actually rewires their entire nervous system to send out a signal that only certain types of people can detect. The manipulators, the emotionally unavailable, the ones who need fixing. These people don't stumble into the empath's life randomly. They're being called in by something the empath doesn't even know they're broadcasting. But here's what will change everything you thought you understood about yourself. When this core wound finally heals, and Jung was very specific about what triggers that healing, the attraction doesn't shift gradually over months or years. It flips, instantly, completely, as if someone reached into your energetic field and reversed the polarity. The people who used to feel magnetic suddenly feel repulsive. The connections that once felt like destiny suddenly feel like obvious traps you can't believe you didn't see before. And entirely new types of people you never even noticed existed, suddenly start appearing in your life as if they were there all along, just waiting for you to become ready to see them. Jung called this phenomenon the sovereignty shift, and he documented it across decades of clinical work with empaths who had reached what he termed the breaking point of self-betrayal. The moment when continuing to abandon yourself becomes more painful than the terror of finally choosing yourself. If you've ever felt like you keep attracting the same type of person in different bodies, if you've wondered why your relationships always follow the same painful pattern no matter how much you try to choose differently, if you've asked yourself why being sensitive feels more like a curse than a gift, this isn't coincidence. This is the core wound expressing itself through your life. And understanding what Jung discovered about this wound, about why it exists and what it's actually protecting you from seeing about yourself, will completely reframe every relationship you've ever had. Because the person you've been trying to save in every connection wasn't the other person. It was a version of yourself you abandoned so long ago that you forgot she even existed. Drop a comment below if you've ever felt this pattern in your own life, that sense of repeating the same relationship with different faces. Because what I'm about to share with you goes deeper than anything you've heard before about why empaths struggle in love. To understand the core wound, you first need to understand what Jung discovered about empaths that contradicts everything popular psychology teaches. Most people think empaths are naturally kind, naturally giving, naturally self-sacrificing. But Jung found something different. He found that empaths aren't born this way. They're made. And they're made through a very specific type of childhood experience that has nothing to do with overt abuse or neglect. In fact, many empaths Jung studied came from families that looked perfectly functional from the outside. No alcoholism, no violence, no obvious dysfunction. Just something far more subtle and far more damaging. A parent or primary caregiver who was emotionally inconsistent in a particular way. Sometimes present, sometimes absent. Sometimes warm, sometimes cold. Sometimes approving, sometimes withdrawing. And the child, sensitive by nature, quickly learned that their survival depended on being able to predict and manage the adult's emotional state. This is where the empath's extraordinary perceptual abilities actually originate. Not from some spiritual gift or divine calling, but from nervous system adaptation to environmental instability. The child had to become hypervigilant to micro-expressions, tone shifts, energy changes, because their sense of safety depended on reading the room accurately and adjusting their behavior to keep the adult regulated. Jung called this the birth of the false self through emotional labor. The child learned that their authentic feelings, needs, and perceptions were secondary to maintaining the adult's emotional equilibrium. When they were naturally joyful but the parent was depressed, they learned to dim their light. When they were naturally upset but the parent couldn't handle it, they learned to suppress their pain. When they saw things clearly but the parent needed them to pretend otherwise, they learned to doubt their own perception. Year after year, interaction after interaction, the child built a personality structure organized entirely around one core belief. My authentic self is too much, and if I show it, I will be abandoned. This belief becomes the foundation of the core wound. And here's what makes it so insidious. The child doesn't just learn to hide their authentic self. They learn to completely lose contact with it. By the time they reach adulthood, they genuinely don't know what they actually feel, want, or need anymore. They've become so skilled at reading others and adapting to external demands that their own internal compass has gone completely offline. They've developed what Jung termed the empathic override, where other people's feelings are louder in their nervous system than their own. They can tell you exactly what everyone else in the room is experiencing, but if you ask them what they themselves are feeling, they go blank. They've spent so many years living outside of themselves, monitoring and managing everyone else, that they've become strangers to their own inner world. Now here's where Jung's work gets really uncomfortable, because what he discovered next challenges the entire narrative empaths tell themselves about why they keep choosing unavailable people. Jung found that empaths don't choose these people despite their unavailability. They choose them because of it. The core wound creates a very specific template for what feels like love, and that template is based entirely on the childhood dynamic that created the wound in the first place. Love, to the wounded empath, feels like trying to earn something that's being withheld. It feels like working hard to stabilize someone who's emotionally inconsistent. It feels like proving your worth by managing someone else's chaos. This isn't conscious. The empath isn't sitting there thinking, I want someone who will reject me. But their nervous system has been trained to recognize this dynamic as home. When they meet someone who's fully available, emotionally consistent, and genuinely interested in them without requiring performance or pursuit, their nervous system doesn't register it as attraction. It registers it as boring, flat, lacking chemistry. Because chemistry for the wounded empath is actually just the activation of their childhood wound. That anxious feeling of not knowing where you stand. That hypervigilance about whether you're doing enough. That constant monitoring of the other person's emotional state to figure out how to be. The empath has learned to interpret this anxiety as passion, this instability as intensity, this emotional labor as intimacy. So they walk right past the people who could actually love them well, because those people don't activate their wound, and they become obsessed with the people who do, calling it a soul connection when it's actually just trauma recognition. Jung documented case after case of empaths who were completely blind to this pattern. They would insist that they wanted a healthy relationship, that they were trying to choose differently, that they couldn't understand why they kept attracting the same type. But when Jung would point out the available people in their lives who were genuinely interested, the empaths would have a list of reasons why those people weren't right. Too boring. Too simple. No spark. No depth. What they meant, though they couldn't see it, was that those people didn't make them feel like they had to earn love. And without that familiar struggle, it didn't feel like love at all. The core wound had convinced them that if someone chooses you easily, it doesn't count. Real love, according to the wound, requires suffering. Real connection requires sacrifice. Real intimacy requires abandoning yourself to prove your devotion. This is the template. And until it's healed, the empath will keep seeking it out, calling it fate, calling it destiny, calling it a soul contract, when actually it's just repetition compulsion wearing a spiritual mask. So what actually heals this wound? Jung was very specific about this, and it's not what most people want to hear. The wound doesn't heal through finding the right person who finally sees you and loves you correctly. It doesn't heal through doing more inner work or setting better boundaries or learning communication skills. Those things can help, but they don't touch the core. The wound heals through what Jung called the experience of betrayal so profound that it shatters your ability to deny what you've been doing to yourself. It heals when someone you trusted completely, someone you believed was different, someone you poured your entire soul into trying to save and stabilize and earn love from, reveals themselves to be exactly like all the others. And in that moment of devastating clarity, something breaks open inside you. Not your heart, your illusion. The illusion that if you just tried harder, loved better, gave more, sacrificed deeper, you could finally earn the consistent love you've been chasing your entire life. Jung found that this moment of shattering is actually the birth of the true self. Because when the illusion breaks, when you finally see with absolute clarity that no amount of self-abandonment will ever be enough to make an unavailable person choose you, You're forced to confront the real question you've been running from your entire life. Why have I been choosing people who require me to abandon myself in the first place? And this question, if you let yourself really sit with it instead of immediately jumping to the next relationship or distraction, will take you straight into the core wound. You'll start remembering the way you learned to go quiet when you were naturally loud, the way you learned to smile when you were actually hurting, the way you learned to say you were fine when you were falling apart. The thousands of tiny moments across your childhood where you got the message that your authentic self was too much and you needed to become smaller, more manageable, more pleasing to be acceptable. What have you been doing to yourself in relationships that mirrors what was done to you as a child? Drop a comment if this question is landing somewhere deep, because the answer to this question is where your healing actually begins. When the empath finally sees this pattern clearly, something Jung called the sovereignty awakening begins to happen. It's not a single moment. It's a series of realizations that build on each other, each one bringing you closer to the truth of who you actually are beneath all the conditioning. The first realization is that your sensitivity was never the problem. You weren't too much. You were simply surrounded by people who were too little, people who couldn't handle the fullness of your emotional range because they were busy suppressing their own. You learned to call your depth dramatic and your intuition paranoid and your needs burdensome because the people around you needed you to be smaller so they could avoid dealing with their own unprocessed pain. The second realization is that every person you tried to save was actually a mirror of the part of yourself you abandoned. You kept choosing emotionally unavailable people because you were emotionally unavailable to yourself. You kept trying to stabilize people who wouldn't do their own work because you wouldn't do yours. You kept pursuing people who couldn't see your worth because you couldn't see it either. The pattern wasn't about them. It was about you choosing external relationships that matched your internal relationship with yourself. The third realization, and this is the one that changes everything, is that you have a choice. You've always had a choice. You weren't actually trapped in these dynamics, you were participating in them. And the moment you see this, really see it without defensiveness or self-blame, you become free. Because if you chose it unconsciously, you can choose differently consciously. Jung called this the reclamation of personal authority. The moment when you stop being a victim of your patterns and become the author of your life. But here's what Jung warned about, and why so many empaths never complete this healing. The moment you start to wake up, the moment you start to see the pattern clearly and reclaim your power, your entire social system will try to pull you back. The people who benefited from your self-abandonment will suddenly become very concerned about you. They'll tell you you're changing in ways that worry them. They'll say you're becoming selfish or cold or not yourself anymore. What they mean is that you're becoming unavailable for the role you used to play, and it's threatening to them because now they have to face themselves. This is the test. This is where most empaths fall back into the old pattern, because the discomfort of disappointing others feels unbearable. But Jung found that the empaths who push through this discomfort, who choose their own sovereignty even when it costs them relationships, are the ones who finally break free. They stop apologizing for taking up space. They stop explaining their boundaries. They stop trying to make people understand. They simply become unavailable for dynamics that require them to betray themselves. And they do it without guilt. Now here's where the attraction flip actually happens, and it's not mystical or magical. It's purely psychological. When you stop abandoning yourself, when you stop broadcasting the signal that you're available for people who need you to be small, your energetic frequency literally changes. You're no longer resonating at the frequency of the wound. You're resonating at the frequency of wholeness. And this shift is instantaneous. Jung documented this across his clinical work. Empaths who completed the sovereignty awakening reported that within days, sometimes within hours, the people in their lives began responding to them differently. The manipulators became uncomfortable and started pulling away. The emotionally dependent became angry and accused them of changing. The unavailable suddenly wanted to commit, not because they actually changed, but because the empath's disinterest activated their own wound. Meanwhile, entirely different people started appearing. People who were emotionally mature, psychologically aware, and genuinely available. People who didn't need fixing or saving or convincing. People who could meet the empath at their actual depth instead of requiring them to shrink. The empath would often say it felt like these people appeared out of nowhere, but Jung understood they were always there. The empath just couldn't see them before because their wound was filtering their perception, showing them only what was familiar. When you're operating from the wound, you literally cannot recognize healthy love because it doesn't match your template. It doesn't create the anxiety you've learned to interpret as chemistry. It doesn't require the performance you've learned to interpret as intimacy. So you dismiss it, overlook it, or actively avoid it, while obsessing over people who activate your wound and calling it a deep connection. But when you heal the wound, your perception clears. You start seeing people as they actually are instead of as projections of your unmet childhood needs. You start feeling genuine compatibility instead of trauma bonding. You start recognizing red flags immediately instead of explaining them away. And most importantly, you start trusting yourself completely. Your intuition, which you spent years doubting and overriding, comes back online with crystal clarity. You know within minutes whether someone is emotionally available or performing availability. You can feel the difference between genuine interest and manipulative love bombing. You sense people's true intentions beneath their words. And you trust these perceptions without needing external validation, because you're no longer abandoning yourself to maintain connection. What are you starting to recognize about yourself through this conversation? What's becoming clearer about the patterns you've been living? Share in the comments, because your insight might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to begin their own healing. But Jung also warned about something that trips up many empaths during this transition. He called it the pendulum swing of overcorrection. When empaths first heal the core wound and start setting boundaries, they often swing too far in the opposite direction. They become hypervigilant about any sign of emotional need in others. They interpret someone having a bad day as manipulation. They see any request for support as an attempt to make them responsible for someone else's feelings. They build walls instead of boundaries, shutting people out completely rather than learning to let people in selectively. This overcorrection is understandable. After years of being exploited for your empathy, of course you'd become protective. But Jung found that this phase, if you stay in it too long, becomes its own trap. You end up isolated, convinced that everyone is toxic and you're the only one doing the work. You become rigid where you used to be porous, judgmental where you used to be accepting. You've traded one extreme for another instead of finding the middle path. The integrated empath, the one who has truly healed the core wound, doesn't lose their sensitivity. They refine it. They can still feel deeply and sense accurately, but now they have discernment. They can distinguish between someone who's genuinely struggling and asking for reasonable support versus someone who's trying to make their emotional regulation your responsibility. They can offer compassion without taking on someone else's pain as their own. They can witness suffering without believing they have to fix it. This is what Jung meant by love with sovereignty. You don't become less empathic. You become empathic with wisdom. You care deeply, but you care from a place of fullness rather than depletion. You give generously, but only to people who respect what you're offering instead of demanding it as if they're entitled. You stay open, but you're selective about who gets access to your inner world. The people who've earned it through their own emotional maturity and reciprocity get to see your depth. Everyone else gets your kindness and your boundaries, but not your soul. And this selective availability is what creates the attraction flip. Because now, you're only energetically available to people who can meet you at your level. People who are still operating from their wounds can sense that you're no longer a match, and they naturally fall away. Meanwhile, people who've done their own work recognize you as someone who can handle their depth, and they move toward you. It's not that you're attracting different people. It's that you're finally able to recognize and receive the love that was always trying to reach you but couldn't get past your wound's filter. The relationship you've always wanted wasn't unavailable. You were unavailable to receive it because you were too busy chasing relationships that confirmed your childhood belief that love requires suffering. Now that you've healed that belief, you can finally see what was there all along. So how do you know if you've actually healed the core wound or if you're just in another phase of the cycle? Jung gave very specific markers, and they're not what most people expect. The first marker is that you stop needing to understand why people treated you the way they did. You stop analyzing their childhood, their wounds, their reasons. You simply accept that they showed you who they were through their actions, and you believe them. You don't need closure or apologies or explanations. You're complete within yourself. The second marker is that you can witness someone's potential without feeling responsible for helping them reach it. You can see that someone could be amazing if they did their work, and you can wish them well from a distance instead of sacrificing yourself trying to wake them up. Their journey is theirs. Yours is yours, and you trust that completely. The third marker is that rejection no longer devastates you. When someone doesn't choose you, you don't spiral into questioning your worth or wondering what you did wrong. You recognize that not everyone will be a match, and that's not a reflection of your value. It's just information about compatibility. You move on without taking it personally. The fourth marker is that you can be alone without feeling lonely. You've developed such a rich relationship with yourself that your own company feels nourishing rather than empty. You don't need someone else to feel complete. You're already whole. Relationship becomes something you want, not something you need. The fifth marker, and this is the most telling, is that you start attracting people who scare you a little bit. Not in a dangerous way, but in a vulnerable way. People who are so available, so consistent, so genuinely interested, that it activates your fear of actually being loved well. When this happens and you feel that instinct to run or sabotage or find something wrong with them, and you stay anyway, choosing to let yourself be loved even though it's terrifying, that's when you know the wound has healed. Because you're no longer choosing what's familiar, you're choosing what's real. And if you're feeling that fear right now, if you're recognizing that the reason you keep choosing unavailable people is because available people feel too vulnerable, too exposing, too real, comment below and let me know. Because this awareness is the beginning of everything changing. This is where your sovereignty begins. Not in understanding the pattern, but in choosing differently even when your entire nervous system is screaming at you to run back to what feels safe, even though what feels safe has never actually been safe at all. It's been familiar, and there's a profound difference between the two. You've spent your entire life choosing familiar. What would happen if you finally chose real? That question will change your life if you let it. Not because the answer is comfortable, but because asking it means you're finally ready to stop betraying yourself for people who were never going to choose you anyway. You're finally ready to become unavailable for anything less than what you actually deserve. And what you deserve isn't someone who sees your worth after you prove it for years. What you deserve is someone who sees it immediately and treats it as sacred from day one. That person exists. But you'll never recognize them until you heal the wound that keeps telling you love is supposed to hurt. Thank you for staying with me through this entire journey. I know this wasn't easy to hear. I know some of it probably landed in places that are still tender, still healing, still figuring out what's real and what's the wound talking. But the fact that you're here, that you watched until the end, that you're willing to look at these patterns honestly, tells me everything I need to know about you. You're not running anymore. You're ready. And that readiness is everything. If this resonated with you, if you found yourself in these words, I want to hear from you in the comments. Share where you are in this journey. Are you just starting to see the pattern? Are you in the middle of the sovereignty awakening? Are you on the other side, learning to receive love that doesn't require you to shrink? Your story matters. Your experience matters. And sometimes, putting it into words for the first time is what makes it real, what makes the healing stick. Also, if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. Because we're exploring the deepest territories of the human psyche here, the places most people are too afraid to look. We're talking about Jung's wisdom in ways that actually matter, in ways that change lives instead of just filling time. And every week we're going deeper. Lastly, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. You know who they are. The person who keeps choosing the same relationship in different bodies. The person who's so busy saving everyone else that they've completely lost themselves. The person who's starting to wonder if love is supposed to feel this hard. Send it to them. Not with explanation, just with care. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is reflect back to someone what they can't see yet themselves. Thank you. Truly. For your willingness to grow, to question, to look at the uncomfortable truths, and to choose yourself even when everything in you has been trained to choose everyone else first. That choice is sacred, That choice is revolutionary. That choice is what changes everything. I'll see you in the next one.